Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are, welcome to Beach Walk Blog. Today we have a very controversial subject, and I'm gonna tell you what that subject is. It's the squat. Oh my god, you can't talk about the squat. No, mustn't talk about the squat, the sacred squat. Okay, so I want to ask you right now, do you think the squat is a dysfunctional movement? Yes or no? Answer the question. Alright, so I'm going to start this off by saying the squat is different depending on whether you are doing the movement with your feet pointing outwards, with your feet abducted from the midline, or whether you're doing what's typically known as an Asian squat, where your feet, and you'll see kids do this. So there's the fitness industry squat, which is what I just described, where your feet are like this. Or there's the Asian squat, or the young kids squat, where your feet are like this. Okay? So the question I just asked is a squat dysfunctional? Well, it depends on what kind and why you're doing it. Because whether something's functional is dependent on why you're doing it. Now, I've ragged pretty hard on squats in the past. And no one ever comes back to me and asks me, well, hey, hold on a second, which kind of squat are you talking about, Paul? Nobody does that, because everybody just wants to argue. Now, I've never found anybody who's come back and said to me, hey, well, which kind of squat are you talking about? Because in their minds, there's only one kind of squat. It's the CrossFit squat, the fitness industry squat, where your feet are wide, abducted from the midline, and your feet point outwards. They're externally rotated. Now, is that squat functional for squatting in that way? Well, of course not. Of course it's not dysfunctional. But it's massively dysfunctional for running. It's so dysfunctional for running, it's ridiculous. Because, and I'll tell you why, before you throw your arms up in the air and switch off, I'll tell you why it's dysfunctional. Because it only puts you into that position. It doesn't work full range of motion at the hip. It doesn't bring you into an adducted hip position, leg position, foot position. It doesn't get you into a position of internal rotation and extension. It doesn't get you into a position where you can rotate your torso at all. So none of that is functional for running, right? Right? Okay, good. Now, is it functional for squatting in that way? Yes, of course it is. Of course, absolutely it is. But why are you doing it that way? Why are you doing it that way? Well, because you're trying to squat with a heavy loaded bar on your shoulders. So what that does is it raises your own center of mass way up and forces you to be relatively unstable, because if you're standing like this with your feet side by side and you've got a weight on top of your shoulders, that is super unstable, because the bar is 8 feet long, and you've got weights on either side of it. The slightest movement makes it all unbalanced and makes it all wobbly, and you can't control that with your feet together, right? That's why you have your feet wide, and that's why you have your feet externally rotated to that 45-degree position, because it's the most stable way to be with a bar on top of your shoulders. Of course, but that's not an Asian squat, or the squat that a young child would do who's got good movement. And that's the problem, that's the point, that's the problem. That's what you keep missing. So when I say squatting is dysfunctional for runners, the kind of squat I'm talking about is the kind of squat that you do. It's the exact kind of squat that you do. It's that fitness industry CrossFit wide abducted feet externally rotated squat up and down position. It's not the Asian squat. It's not the Asian squat where people are doing this squat. They're getting down into a squat position to rest. It's a resting position, right? It's a resting position. You see kids drop down into this classic kid squat, and they can be there for ages. They can be there for minutes. They can be there for a long time. You can't do that. You can't do that at all with your fitness industry squat. And why would you? Because that's not the point of it. So this is something that if you ever took the plunge into the Sling method, you would see and you would understand if you went beyond the runner's rehab and the basic 8. And again, this is the problem. Your people are they're listening to respond. They're listening to argue. They're reading my posts to argue with me rather than reading my posts to think deeper and learn more. That's the problem. It's the problem with the entire world. Everybody just wants to argue with each other. But the difference with me is that I've put all of this information out there. Big deep sigh. But people just want to argue with me on the surface. You want to really just want to read it just to argue, just to argue. It's kind of boring and tiring, to be honest with you, because I've said this over and over, and I've actually got it in the intermediate 10 where we do a squat. We do a squat. Oh my goodness, we do a squat? You hate squats. You told me that squats are dysfunctional. No, I didn't. I told you the squats that you're doing are dysfunctional. I never said the squats that I'm doing are dysfunctional. I never said that at all. I never ever once said that at all. It's the squats that you're doing that are dysfunctional, not the squats that I'm doing. And that's the thing, is that you're doing a dysfunctional squat and then you're running with a dysfunctional gait. You see the correlation there? And the causation is there as well. And the reason why you have to squat in the way you squat is because you can't move in the way that you need to move in order to do a squat in the way that I do my squats. Because you don't have the internal rotation capability in your hips, and your feet don't work the way that they should do. That's one of the reasons why you can't move and you can't up your mileage, or you can't move very well and you can't up your mileage without getting injured. Because the squat that you're doing is dysfunctional, and the squat that you're doing is a compensated squat movement for the movements that you're lacking in your body. Okay, so if we agree, and we absolutely must agree, that strength is specific to the movement, then we can see that that movement is specific to that movement, and the range of motion at the joints that we're using and the muscles surrounding the joints that we're moving. So like I said, if you have your feet pointing outwards at 45 degrees, you are externally rotated. Okay? If your feet then don't go into an internal rotation movement, then you haven't used your internal rotators to power internal rotation. You might have gone into extension, but you very much likely did that from your quads. You've got your feet and your legs abducted from the midline, which is going to overuse your TFLs and your glute medius, glute minimus and piriformis, and you still wonder why you've got hip problems. You still wonder why you've got knee pain. And you still wonder why your feet don't work very well, and you still wonder why you get injured when you try and increase your mileage. It's because your movement is dysfunctional, and you're compensating by doing things that you can do in ways that you can do them on repeat for hundreds of reps with weights on your shoulders to make it worse. Because what you're doing is you're already compensating for the fact that you can't do it in a different way, by doing it in that way, and then you're just adding weight to it. You're just reinforcing and deeply ingraining the fact that you can't move very well. That's what's going on. I'm being quite blunt when I say this. I'm just being to the point and blunt because it needs to be said. It needs to be said. I know you don't think that a squat is dysfunctional because everybody who squats with heavy weights in the way that you do your squats is telling you, no, squats are functional. Squats are functional. They're a functional movement. But yet everybody who's doing that is not a runner. Or they're coaches and trainers who are not runners, who don't need to internally rotate. Now, if I can pretty much guarantee you, if I got them to start a running program that demands internal rotation, pronation and supination in a foot, hip extension with internal rotation, pronation and supination, and torso rotation, as soon as they start to increase their mileage, they would get injured. I can pretty much guarantee that. But they're so strong. They're so strong. Oh, they're so strong. Great. They're strong in that dysfunctional CrossFit style fitness industry squat that's externally rotated, abducted, and not creating the movement that we need. Now, if you watch any high level powerlifter, somebody just doing a squat who's a high level squatter, let's put it that way, high level weightlifter, powerlifter, Olympic lifter, whatever, you will see that when they get to the bottom of their squat movement, the first thing that happens is that they adduct and internally rotate their femurs. And I'll tell you why that happens. Because it must happen. Because the thing that allows the glutes to fire and function really well is the adductors. The adductors have to pull the femur inwards to then allow the glute max to pull on the femur and lift you up. Okay, everything acts as an anchor for something else. So muscles need stable points. They need an anchor point. They need a point of stability to pull on, to then pull another bone or bones or group of bones, and to apply force to those bones. Okay? Now, if you don't have your adductors pulling the femur inwards and your glutes pull your femur outwards, all you do is get external rotation. All you do, you actually collapse. Okay? Now you need those adductors to pull the femur inwards, to hold it there, whilst the glute pulls to lift you up. And then the quad can then act on the femur, or act on the tibia, should I say, and the femur as well, and pull it into extension. There's a lot more that goes on as well, because there's hamstring involvement as well, and calf involvement, but not very much, because they're not acting specifically on their bones, on their joints, to move their joints particularly well. But like I said, even in that wide stance, abducted, externally rotated squat movement, the adductors are key in the prep for the glutes to contract and then get you up out of your squat. Because if the adductors weren't there, the glutes they would have nothing to act upon, because they have to pull onto the femur to pull the pelvis into a posterior nutation, which is a posterior pelvic tilt, to get you to extend the hip and then stand up. You absolutely, unequivocally need your adductors, ADD, adductors, to hold that femur rock solid. Now, because we know that there's a sequence of movements, if every muscle fired at the same time, you wouldn't get any movement. Well, you'd get a little bit, but it would be purely isometric. So there wouldn't be much movement, if any. you just stay still. If every muscle fired at the same time, you wouldn't get much movement, if any. Now there's a sequence of events that happens. It's like a chain reaction. It's like a, and part of that sequence is what I've worked on and figured out of the gait cycle. What has to happen first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th, and so on and so on, to make it so that things are happening in the correct order. And that's why it has to go lateral flexion, shoulder depression, shoulder girdle depression, creates torso rotation, which creates opposite pelvic rotation, which drives the legs. Okay? So the same thing applies when you do a squat. Exact same sequence, oh, sorry, not the same sequence, but the same A sequence occurs. Not the same sequence because it's a completely different movement, but a sequence occurs. And you can see that, and I've put videos up to show that. That what happens with every single person who's squatting, every high level squatter, lifter, when they get to the bottom of their squat, their knees go inwards. And they should. And they absolutely should. It's not that the person's glutes aren't strong enough. No, it's the sequence of events. If I want to fire my glutes the best, I should be internally rotating before I externally rotate. I should be flexing before I extend. That's the way it works. It's called potentiation. I have to potentiate the muscle that's going to work to get it to then work. Otherwise it's a voluntary contraction, and we want involuntary contractions or stretch reflex contractions to occur. And that's what happens when you're at the bottom of a fitness industry squat. Okay, you get internal rotation, medial rotation of the femur, adduction of the knees before you get the reverse action. Because that's what has to happen, because the femur needs to be stabilized to the midline before the glutes can act upon it. Because if they don't, they'll just pull the femur out and you collapse, which is exactly what happens to people, a lot of people, when they run. If your glutes are too strong for your adductors, it pulls your femur outwards and you collapse, you get a contralateral hip drop. That's what happens when your foot's turned out. If your torso isn't doing its job, that's what will happen, because you're not training the torso to do what it should do as a part of that sequence. You're training a dysfunctional movement. Okay, you're training a dysfunctional movement. You're not training internal rotation. You're not training pronation, supination, and big toe pressure, big toe flexion. You're not training that torso rotation. You're not training the plantar flexion. You're not training any of it. It's dysfunctional. Now, the Asian squat, the kid squat, the child squat, it's still forcing the wrong plane of motion. It's still forcing an upward, downward orientation. But it's not dysfunctional. It's not as dysfunctional. It's not dysfunctional. Let's leave it that way. It's not dysfunctional, because you're not specifically training the external rotation, abduction part of the equation. You're training to keep the knees in the same place. You're training to keep them in line over first and second toe. Okay? So it's very, very different. Now, like I said, most people, and this is a real shame, most people stop at the runner's rehab and the basic 8, and you shouldn't. You should go through the whole thing, right? You should keep going into the intermediate 10, because guess what? I put those squats in there, the functional squat for running, the runner's squat, and I've called it, in the intermediate 10, I've called it an anti-gravity squat, because what you're doing is you're working to get down. You're not resisting down, you're working to get down, because you're working against resistance. The resistance is trying to pull you up, and you're having to work to get down. So what that's going to do is, it's going to help to unblock your movement. It's going to help to create functional movements in your pelvis, in your femur, It's going to create those internal rotation actions that I'm talking about, the ones that your dysfunctional squats have created, or your dysfunctional movements have taken you to a dysfunctional squat, which has then reinforced that crappy movement and then caused you to, when you increase your mileage, get injured, because it's the only movement you have access to. You don't have access to internal rotation. That's the problem. Okay, so when I say squats are dysfunctional, I'm not talking about the kind of squats that would be considered the quote-unquote Asian squat, or the kid squat, the child squat, or the anti-gravity squat that I do and that I made, created, developed. Okay, I'm not talking about those ones. I'm talking about the ones that you do, the ones that you do all the time, the ones that you do too much of. Okay, so no, squats aren't dysfunctional when you do them the way that I do them, but they are if you're doing the fitness industry CrossFit style squat and you are a runner, because remember, those two things are different. One requires gobs of internal rotation and one produces zero internal rotation. Okay, so just think about that. Okay, I never ever said that we shouldn't squat. I said if you are injured, stop squatting. Okay, because you've already proven it to yourself that these squats that you do, that you put them on a pedestal and they're like, oh, the god of all movements, the squat. No, it's not the god of all movements. It's not at all. The gait cycle. Gait cycle is the king of all movement, or the queen of all movement, whatever. You know what I mean? It's not the squat, and it certainly isn't your dysfunctional CrossFit fitness industry squat. Now, if you took the plunge and you went a little bit deeper into the Sling method, you'd see how I include and incorporate the squat into a functional for running. Okay, because remember, everything is functional for something, but not everything is functional for everything, except for gait. Because working on your gait will actually allow you to squat better, because you're working on every single movement that your body can produce. Okay, so there we go. There is your beach walk blog for the day. Hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was enlightening. I hope you understood it. And if you didn't, ask me a question, because I just want to help you. I just want to help. Talk to you in the next beach walk blog. Take care. Bye bye.